Berlin, April 1945. A city crumbling under the weight of its own ashes. The sky wasn't blue. It was a bruised black and crimson, choked by the smoke of 1,000 bombs. The roar of Soviet tanks shook the earth like an approaching apocalypse. While Hitler was locked away in his bunker, a different kind of game was being played in the shattered streets above. High-ranking officers were vanishing like ghosts in the chaos. Some were captured, some took their own lives. But one name remained a haunting void in the records: General Erich von Brandt. Von Brandt was no ordinary officer. He was a ghost strategist. His job wasn't just to fight the war, but to prepare for what came after the inevitable collapse. While the world prepared to celebrate the Allied victory, von Brandt was allegedly coordinating a classified initiative known only as Phase 3. He was last seen on the night of April 29th, leading a small convoy away from the Berlin Chancellery. 3 dark staff cars, running without lights, slipped through the ruins like a funeral procession. And then, silence. A silence that would remain unbroken for 81 years. For decades, historians scoured the globe. From the hidden corners of Argentina to the dense jungles of Brazil, they hunted for a shadow of von Brandt. But they found nothing. No death certificate, no grave, and not a single credible witness. Intelligence agencies eventually stamped the file cold case and archived it. The world assumed the general had perished in the firestorm of Berlin, his body lost to the soil. But the earth does not always destroy secrets. Sometimes it preserves them. The story takes a chilling turn exactly 81 years later, in the quiet, rolling hills of a remote farm in Lower Bavaria. The farm's owner, a 70-year-old farmer, had complained for years about a strange anomaly in one of his fields. He claimed that a specific patch of land was cursed. Crops would never grow there, and during heavy rain, the water would vanish into the ground as if swallowed by a hidden mouth. Neighbors dismissed it as an old man's superstition. But on a Tuesday morning in 2026, when the farmer used a new, deep plowing tractor, the earth let out a sound he had never heard before, a deep, metallic groan. Thinking it was an old irrigation pipe, he began to clear the dirt. But beneath the topsoil, he didn't find clay or rock. He found a thick sheet of reinforced steel. This wasn't a farm implement. It was a hatch, perfectly concealed and buried for generations. When local authorities and historians arrived, they expected a routine air raid shelter. But when they deployed ground-penetrating radar, the results sent a shockwave through the team. This wasn't just a room. Beneath the quiet farmhouse lay a massive underground complex, buried so deep that no standard survey could have ever detected it. But the biggest question remained. If this was just a bunker, why was it so meticulously hidden? And if it belonged to von Brandt, did he ever make it inside? Or was he using it to hide something else entirely? As experts attempted to force the hatch open using hydraulic pressure, they realized something terrifying. The door hadn't been locked from the outside. It had been sealed from within. The implication was clear. Whoever entered that bunker never intended to come out. What lay inside? Was an 81-year-old corpse waiting for them in the dark? Or something else? Something so dangerous that General von Brandt sacrificed his life to keep it hidden from the world? The true story was only just beginning, because on the wall of that entrance, the team found a symbol that didn't belong to the regular Nazi army. It belonged to a secret unit that officially never existed. The metallic hatch didn't yield easily. It was as if the bunker itself was holding its breath, resisting the intrusion of the modern world. When the hydraulic seals finally groaned and the heavy steel plate swung open, a rush of air escaped from the depths, air that had been trapped since 1945. It was cold, unnervingly dry, and carried the faint, metallic scent of oil and old electricity. The team of historians and engineers stood at the edge of the dark rectangle in the earth, their high-powered flashlights cutting through a darkness that had remained undisturbed for over 8 decades. As they began their descent, the structure revealed its true nature. This wasn't a damp, cramped shelter. The staircase was made of industrial-grade steel, descending nearly 30 feet into the bedrock of the Bavarian hills. The walls were lined with wool-insulated panels, a luxury unheard of in standard wartime construction. It became immediately clear that this was a command node, a high-priority facility designed for long-term habitation and absolute secrecy. At the bottom of the stairs, the team reached a heavy inner door. Etched into the center was the symbol they had glimpsed at the entrance, a stylized silver wolf's head. It wasn't the standard eagle or swastika of the Third Reich. This was the insignia of Silber-Grau, silver gray, a unit so clandestine that its existence was only whispered about in the most classified Allied intelligence reports. Silber-Grau was the unit tasked with hibernation, the preservation of the Reich's most critical assets and mines for a future that was never supposed to come. The door was unlocked. As it creaked open, the flashlights illuminated a central chamber that looked like a frozen moment in time. A heavy oak desk sat in the center of the room, bolted to the floor. A half-empty bottle of schnapps and a porcelain cup sat on its surface, as if the occupant had just stepped out for a moment. Along the walls were rows of high-frequency radio equipment, their vacuum tubes dusty but remarkably intact. These were modified transmitters, capable of reaching locations far beyond the borders of Europe. "Look at the maps," one historian whispered, his voice trembling. On the far wall, a massive topographical map of the Alps was pinned. It was covered in red and black markings, not troop movements, but coordinates. Each mark represented a node, a hidden station like the one they were currently standing in. The map suggested a terrifying reality. Von Brandt wasn't just hiding. He was the administrator of a silent, underground network that spanned across Switzerland, Italy, and Austria. But it was the corner of the room that drew the most attention. Slumped in a high-backed leather chair was a figure. The dry, refrigerated air of the deep bunker had acted as a natural preservative. The man wore the gray field jacket of a general, the Iron Cross still pinned to his collar. His skin was like parchment, stretched tight over his bones, but his features were unmistakable. It was General Erich von Brandt. He hadn't died in a struggle. There was no sign of violence in the room. He sat upright, his hands resting on his lap, facing the radio equipment as if waiting for a signal that never arrived. On the desk in front of him lay a leather-bound journal, its silver clasp glinting in the light of the torches. As the lead researcher reached for the journal, he noticed a small, battery-operated calendar on the desk. The numbers had long since faded, but the final manual entry was clear. It wasn't dated 1945. The general had survived in this hole, alone, for years after the war had officially ended. He had been a ghost living beneath the feet of an oblivious world, monitoring the radio waves, waiting for the Phase 3 orders to emerge from the shadows. The researcher carefully unlatched the journal. The first few pages were standard military logs, but as he flipped toward the middle, the handwriting changed. It became tighter, more frantic. The final entry, written in dark, rushed ink, contained a single sentence that would change the course of the investigation. The transmission was received. The gray never sleeps. If von Brandt was dead, who had he received a transmission from? And more importantly, if the gray never sleeps, who else was still out there, waiting in the silence of the mountains? The discovery of the general's body was only the beginning. As the team moved deeper into the bunker, the atmosphere shifted from a historical curiosity to a crime scene of global proportions. Behind the main desk, a secondary door led to a climate-controlled archive, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets, each one bearing the Silber-Grau wolf insignia. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a repository of stolen history, a collection of documents and artifacts that the crumbling Reich had deemed too dangerous to fall into Allied hands. Inside these cabinets, the team found hundreds of microfilms and original blueprints. These were not designs for tanks or planes, but for something far more insidious: hibernation protocols. They detailed how a network of sleeper agents, known as Watchers, were to be embedded into civilian populations across the globe. The records included detailed maps of the Underground Railroad, of war criminals, showing escape routes through the Alps that were guarded by stations exactly like the one they were standing in. One specific folder, labeled Operation Silber-Grau, Phase 3, contained a list of coordinates that spanned the South American coastline and the American Midwest. Beside each coordinate was a name and a status. Most were marked as active or awaiting signal. The realization hit the researchers like a physical blow. General von Brandt hadn't been hiding in this bunker to save himself. He had been the master switch, the central communication hub responsible for keeping the flame of a dead ideology alive in total silence. As they examined the high-frequency radio setup, a technician made a startling discovery. The equipment wasn't just old military surplus. It was far more advanced than anything standard issue for 1945. The transmitter had been modified to pulse signals at frequencies that would have been invisible to post-war Allied surveillance. More disturbingly, the technical logs showed that the machine had been operational long after the power grid of Germany had collapsed. The bunker was powered by a primitive but effective geothermal generator, tapping into the natural heat of the earth to keep the general's vigil alive for years. The team then turned their attention to the general's journal. The handwriting in the later entries was no longer that of a disciplined soldier, but of a man consumed by a terrifying purpose. In an entry dated October 1952, von Brandt wrote, "The world thinks we are a memory. They build their cities over our graves, not knowing that the foundations are ours. Today, I heard the voice of the Rhine on the shortwave. They are ready." This entry confirmed the darkest theories of the historians. The Gray Network wasn't a myth. It was a functioning, post-war entity. The general had spent nearly a decade underground, not in despair, but in active command. He had monitored the birth of the Cold War, the rise of new superpowers, and the shifting of global borders, all while waiting for the perfect moment to re-emerge. But the most disturbing find was tucked into the back of the journal, a small, black-and-white photograph. It didn't show a Nazi official or a family member. It showed a young man, dressed in 1950s civilian clothing, standing in front of a prominent government building in Washington, D.C. On the back of the photo, in the general's precise script, were the words, "The son of the wolf, our eye in the West." If the son of the wolf was active in the 1950s, where were his descendants now? As the team worked, the motion sensors they had installed at the bunker entrance suddenly tripped. Someone, or something, was moving in the fields above, near the very farm that had kept this secret for 81 years. The researchers realized they weren't the only ones interested in what von Brandt had left behind. The alarm at the entrance didn't just signal an intruder. It signaled that the bunker's discovery had triggered a response from a network that was supposed to be dead. Down in the archive, the air grew heavy with a new kind of tension. As the lead researcher, Dr. Erich Thorn, gripped the general's journal, the team's security monitor flickered. A group of black SUVs had pulled onto the gravel path of the remote Bavarian farm. These weren't local police. These men were coordinated, moving with a tactical precision that mirrored the ghost convoy descriptions in von Brandt's own files. The team realized they were trapped in the very structure they had come to investigate. But the bunker had one more secret to give up. Behind the archive, hidden behind a false concrete panel, was a secondary communication vault. This room was filled with modern wiring, fiber optic cables that had been spliced into the ancient German infrastructure. Someone had been visiting this bunker long after the general's death. This silent embassy hadn't been abandoned in the 1950s. It had been upgraded. Dr. Thorne turned to a specialized filing cabinet labeled The Watchers, 1990, present. Inside, they found evidence that made their blood run cold. There were high-resolution satellite photos of global financial hubs, lists of political figures, and detailed dossiers on the children of the wolf, the descendants of the original Silber-Grau operatives. The general's mission hadn't failed. It had evolved into a shadow settlement, a modern-day sleeper network waiting for a signal that was far more contemporary than anything from the 1940s. Among the files was a blueprint of the farmhouse above them. It revealed that the farm wasn't just a random location. It was a switching station. The 70-year-old farmer who had reported the anomaly wasn't an innocent bystander. He was the sentinel. His job was to protect the hatch and maintain the bending of the path, a technique using local geography and misdirection to keep searchers and modern sensors away from the site. As the heavy boots of the tactical team thudded on the farmhouse floor above, Dr. Thorne found the general's final, unnumbered journal entry. It wasn't written in ink, but scratched into the leather cover with a knife. It read, "The first wolf died so the pack could live in the light. If you are reading this, the light is an illusion." Suddenly, the geothermal generator hummed to life, and the radio equipment in the main room began to spark. A signal was being broadcast, not from the bunker, but to the bunker. The vacuum tubes glowed with a ghostly violet light. A voice, distorted by 81 years of static but unmistakably clear, began to recite a string of numbers. It was a number station broadcast, the kind used by spies during the Cold War, but the frequency was one that shouldn't exist in 2026. The researchers looked at each other, the realization dawning on them. The discovery of the bunker wasn't an accident. It was the tripwire. By opening the hatch, they hadn't just found a grave. They had completed a circuit. The Phase 3 signal was now live, and across the globe, in mountain cabins and high-rise offices, the watchers were receiving their final orders. The inner door of the bunker began to hiss. The tactical team above wasn't trying to break in. They were remote sealing the facility from the outside. The historians were about to become the new permanent residents of General von Brandt's tomb. As the heavy hydraulic locks hissed into place, the air in the bunker grew thin. Dr. Thorne and his team were no longer explorers. They were witnesses to a machine that had been waiting for this exact moment for 81 years. The violet glow of the vacuum tubes pulsed in sync with the number station broadcast, a rhythmic heartbeat of a dead empire that refused to stay buried. The lead technician, frantically typing on a laptop connected to the bunker's modern fiber optic splice, looked up with a face devoid of color. "It's not just a signal," he whispered. "It's an upload." The bunker's ancient radio infrastructure was acting as a bridge. It was pulling encrypted data from a satellite network and broadcasting it across the old Silber-Grau frequencies that were now being picked up by thousands of dormant devices disguised as weather stations and mountain repeaters across the Alps. The gray network was waking up, and the researchers were the ones who had flipped the switch. Dr. Thorne turned back to the general's mummified remains. In the flickering light, von Brandt almost seemed to smile. Thorne noticed something he had missed before: a small, translucent wire running from the general's iron cross directly into the leather chair and down into the floorboards. This wasn't just a corpse, it was a bioswitch. The moment the team had moved the body to reach the journal, they had broken a pressurized circuit, notifying the watchers that the sanctuary had been breached. "We have to find the kill switch," Thorne shouted over the rising whine of the geothermal generator. He began tearing through the Phase 3 archive, throwing aside dossiers on sleeper agents until he found a single, hand-drawn schematic labeled Der Letzte Befehl, the final command. It wasn't a blueprint for the bunker, but for a global contingency. If the bunker was ever compromised, the Silber-Grau network wouldn't just hide, it would infect. The schematic showed that the fiber optic cables they had found were connected to the regional power grid and the local telecommunications hub in Munich. The general's Phase 3 wasn't a military invasion, it was a digital one. By using the farm as a node, they were injecting a 1940s-era cryptographic virus, a set of instructions so primitive and deeply coded that modern firewalls wouldn't even recognize them as threats. It was designed to shut down modern infrastructure, creating a blackout that would allow the watchers to move and reorganize in the chaos without being tracked by satellites or drones. Above them, the sound of the tactical team stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. Then, a screen on the wall, one that had been dark since the 1940s, flickered to life. It didn't show the tactical team. It showed a live feed from a dozen different nodes across the world. A quiet suburban home in Ohio, a high-rise office in Tokyo, a remote fishing village in Norway. In each feed, a person stood in front of a hidden terminal, their hands moving in unison with the numbers being broadcast in the bunker. They were the descendants, the children of the wolf. They weren't soldiers in uniforms. They were doctors, lawyers, and engineers who had been raised for this single moment. The general's journal entry echoed in Thorne's mind. We were to wait long enough for the rot to be washed out, long enough for memory to become myth. The technician's laptop suddenly turned red. "The virus, it's out. Munich's grid is fluctuating. The blackout has started." As the lights in the bunker dimmed, the violet glow of the vacuum tubes became the only source of illumination. Dr. Thorne realized that the silver gray hadn't just survived, it had won. The world was about to go dark, and when the lights came back on, the map of the world would look very different. But as the air ran low, Thorne saw one final detail in the final command schematic. There was a second hatch, one that didn't lead back to the farmhouse, but deeper into the mountain, toward the shadow settlement mentioned in the rumors. It was their only chance to survive, but it would lead them directly into the heart of the enemy they had just accidentally resurrected. The second hatch didn't open with a roar, but with a silent, pressurized hiss. As the main bunker's oxygen levels flickered into the red, Dr. Thorne and his team scrambled through the opening, sealing the heavy steel door behind them just as the Munich grid went completely dark. They were no longer in a concrete tomb. They were in a tunnel of smooth, dark stone, illuminated by dim, recessed floor lights that seemed to stretch for miles into the heart of the Bavarian Alps. This was the transition point mentioned in the general's oilcloth maps. They weren't just fleeing. They were walking through the central artery of the Silber-Grau network. As they moved, the tunnel widened into a vast, subterranean hangar. There were no tanks or planes here, but rows of specialized mountain vehicles and crates of equipment marked with current dates: 2024, 2025, and 2026. The Shadow Settlement wasn't a ghost town. It was a fully functional, modern-day staging area, hidden beneath the very mountains tourists hiked every summer. Dr. Thorne realized the terrifying scale of the hibernation protocol. General von Brandt hadn't been a lonely hermit. He was the anchor for a civilization that had moved underground to wait out the century. The team found a central observation deck that looked out over a hidden valley, accessible only through these tunnels. Below them, a small town was visible, its lights powered by the same geothermal energy that had kept the general's radio humming. People moved through the streets, not in uniforms, but in everyday clothes, living lives that had been invisible to the world for 80 years. They didn't just hide, Thorne whispered, looking at a wall of monitors. They integrated. The screens showed the blackout they had triggered was spreading far beyond Munich. Global communications were faltering, and in that darkness, the Watchers were beginning to emerge from their nodes, moving toward these shadow settlements to finalize the transition. The general's mission was complete. The rot of the old world was being washed out by a digital collapse, and the gray was ready to step into the light. The team found one last communication terminal. On the screen, a final message was looping in a high-level cipher. It wasn't a command to attack, it was an invitation. It listed the names of every researcher in the bunker, including Dr. Thorne. The Silver-Grau had been watching them from the moment they stepped onto the farm. The discovery of the hatch wasn't just a tripwire, it was an entrance exam. The network didn't want to kill them. It wanted their expertise to help build the next beginning. As the sun began to rise over the alpine peaks outside, visible through a reinforced glass observation port, the world below was silent. No planes in the sky, no sirens in the distance, just a profound, eerie stillness. Dr. Thorne looked at the mummified hand of the general's journal he still held. The last line of the diary finally made sense. History forgets, but the gray never sleeps. The team stood at the threshold of a new world. They could try to find a way back to a civilization that was currently falling apart, or they could walk deeper into the mountain and see what the Phase 3 future actually looked like. Behind them, the bunker was a grave. Before them, the Alps held a secret that was no longer a myth. The general had vanished in 1945, but as Dr. Thorne looked out at the hidden valley, he realized von Brandt had never truly left. He had simply been waiting for the world to catch up to his silence.